Tonight, we have a panel with Jimmie Briggs moderating. Applaud. And we have 5 fantastic guests. Lisa Crooms couldn't make it. Unfortunately, she was very sick, so unfortunately, she's not here with us tonight. But she was really regretted it, and I got lots of emails from her saying how much she wished she were here tonight. So tonight, we're going to have this panel, but before we begin, I want to do a couple business kinds of things. One is that we have a new project director. Daphne stepped down, and we have Amber Madison, who's our new project director. And Amber is, let me tell you how impressive she is. She is an author of 3 books, freelance writer, media expert, and practicing therapist. She's written for 17, Glamour, Cosmo, and Men's Fitness, among others. Frequently lectures on college campuses about healthy relationships, and appears regularly in the media commenting on issues of sex, gender, and intimate relationships. And we got her as the director. So I'm going to hand it over to her in a second because she wants to tell you about a few things we're doing. But one of the things that is the challenge of doing this organization for Carol, Pedro, and I is creating a community that meets 6 times over the year in person, but continues to have the conversation between conversations. So one of the things we're doing now is we're creating a very fancy interactive website that will be up and running shortly, which is going to not only include blogs, but we want it to actually include your questions and comments in these conversations. So on your table, you see pads. We want everybody to take a pad and to write comments, questions, observations, anything you want. We are then going to collect the pads and transcribe them onto our website to begin to engage in questions with each other about what this work provokes in you and reflecting in your own work. Yeah?
And if you're doing it on a laptop?
Oh, just send us the notes. Exactly, send us the notes. No, you have to do it on the pad. Yeah, and if we're hoping to make this a regular part so that while we have panels talking and you're listening carefully, you're also reflecting on how it relates to your own work and where you are in your own work. So please do that. We are already getting interest from the media. We have some media sitting here, but we're also getting interest from the other media about wanting to know what PACH is about, wanting to write about PACH. So that's very exciting. But I want this to be a collective thing so that we get the voices from all of the members in this conversation, not just Pedro, Carol, and I. So, thinking of, and we have, there's approximately 45 members. Okay, Amber, your turn.
Great. Well, I think Niobe covered a lot of it. But the idea for the website, we have 2 right now. So one that will be living at Steinhardt online, and the other one, we got patch.org, which is awesome. We had to pay a lot of money for it, but it is ours. And so on the website, it's going to be a combination of blogs from you guys. And if the word blog freaks you out, don't worry. I will send an email shortly. Blogs are not intimidating. It only has to be a couple of paragraphs or just some ideas that you have that you want to get out there. Articles that you see that are really in line with our message. Articles you see that drive you absolutely crazy, that you're like, I know they got this wrong, with a little paragraph on top about why they got it wrong. And also our tweets, which is the other thing. We have the Twitter handle, PatchNYU. So if you tweet at us, please follow us, tweet at us. We'll retweet all of your messages. And then the only other thing is I'll probably be reaching out to all of you at some point, talking about your media contacts and figuring out how we can really get all of our voices out there. So thanks.
I'll give you one. I wanted to start off the conversation. First, some of you were in attendance. Prior to the dinner, we had the privilege of hearing Jonathan Shay talk about the issue of moral injury. And near the end of the discussion this evening, you will hear a few comments from him about his remarks earlier, but also the remarks of the panel. First, I'd like to start off with a framing question for each of you by way of introduction. Alisha, I'll start with you since you're next to me. This very basic question: what brought you to PACH? Like, what about PACH attracted you to want to be a part of it? Yes.
Thank you. If I'm going too long, just let me know, because I don't have the privilege of seeing how short other people can be in there. So what brought me to want to join PACH? It was a number of things, but I would say the most salient is this sense that I've been having for a number of years. I'm a researcher, a psychologist. I do research looking at people in domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, kids in very low-income schools, and I look at the mental health effects of living in this sort of chronic state of being oppressed and what that does to a person. And for years now, as a social scientist, I've been feeling dismayed and disappointed in the fact that in order to do our work what's considered the correct way, we have to detach from our subjects, so to speak. We're not allowed to be in connection with them because the belief is that if we're detached, we're objective, and only then can we really tell stories accurately. And so a lot of my work, and this is why I'm attracted to PACH, is really about understanding connection and how we can be in connection with others and how that can actually prevent mental health problems and help people overcome mental health problems. And so maybe I'll give a couple examples just because these are very recent things that happen that I have in my head at this second. You know, a lot of those of us who do research around gender, we think about the fact that girls at a younger and younger age have to feel disconnected, not only from others, because there's the idea that if you're a girl amongst other girls, your relationships need to be defined by this strange combination of closeness and competition, right? So you have to disconnect from others, but very young, you're actually taught that you need to disconnect from yourself, right? So a friend of mine who has a daughter around the age of my youngest daughter, so she's about 6, they got a new puppy, a peekapoo, so you can imagine how small this thing must be. And it's not only a peekapoo, but it's a cross between a Pekingese and a poodle, and it's a puppy. So it's small. And her 6-year-old daughter had a friend come over to play, wanted to meet this puppy. And she said to my friend, the mom, "How much does it weigh?" And my friend said, "Oh, about 8 pounds." And right away, the little 6-year-old girl said, "Oh, what I wouldn't give to weigh just 8 pounds." In a very adult intonation, okay? Somewhere in her young life, she's been taught a self-betrayal, a necessity really to disconnect from yourself because she wants to be something that she never could be, right? And then just 2 mornings ago when I was dropping my 2 girls at school, elementary school, I was walking away, and I didn't realize, I've noticed this in some ways, that at my daughter's schools, there's tends to be, this is generalization, so I'm sorry if I'm speaking in generalizations here, but tends to be older, maybe affluent fathers and younger, very stick-like, wives who tend, I mean, this is just genetics, biologically, will have stick-like daughters, it's true, and I've noticed this over the years. And I think without realizing it, as I dropped off my daughters and I was walking away from the school, there was a girl that on some level I registered, she was an average-sized girl, not a stick, right? So like, let's say a 4th or 5th grader. And I didn't realize that I had registered that until I saw her mom say goodbye to her as she was heading into the school, and the last thing she said to her is, "Don't eat too much." She could be the best athlete at that school. She could be the highest scoring kid in math at that school. But what her mother was saying goodbye to, not "I love you, have a good day, do great on that algebra test." She was saying goodbye to the child who is not small enough, who is not thin enough, right? That is a betrayal. She is being taught by someone who's older than her to betray herself. So what we don't have is a science of that. We don't have a science of humanity. Even when we do the science of emotions as psychology researchers, what we have is a science of typologies and archetypes, not a science of experience. Even when we do research in psychiatry, we have a science of symptoms, not of the human being. And I think that's what attracts me to being involved with PACH.
Great examples. Great examples. Adrian, could you talk about your work in relation to this idea of a common humanity or disconnection from a common humanity?
Take this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, hi. I'm a practicing journalist that takes a really long time to get my stories into print, but they're with me for a really long time before they're published. And one of the main things that drew me to PACH was that the resources that I draw from to sustain my own well-being during very long periods of field work have been often from people among people from other disciplines, partly because I'm not part of the institutional locations of my profession, in large part by choice, I would say. And also, I'm drawn, and I guess I wanted to formalize that in some way, because I find it's taking more time for me to maintain my well-being and my clarity, given the ways in which I'm becoming a more complicated thinker, a more sophisticated thinker, I believe. And so that's one reason. And I guess the other is that I feel a real sense of urgency about what's taken me so long to understand in the work that I do. I really try to go into the work with as open mind as I can have, and that takes many years, actually, to sort of shed away all the kinds of assumptions that I'm not even aware that I hold. And the assumptions are only part of it. There's a lot of practical information that has to be gathered. And I'm very concerned about how to cultivate among young journalists the skills that they need to do this work more efficiently, and that requires all kinds of supports. And historically, those supports for me have been my editors. You know, when Jonathan was speaking this afternoon about the helpfulness of a ritual purification when vets come back from war before they go into civilian life, I've often felt journalists need places where they can not only process their experiences, but share, you know, the joys that are not so apparent in very dark stories, or, you know, the pressure on journalists to make quick meaning of their experience is unrelenting. So I'm very interested in the changes in editorial opportunities, how editors for me have been those places where I can sort of begin to tease out what's happened. But I'm concerned because the pressures on editors are now as unrelenting, I think, as they have been on writers in the past. So I'm interested in using this as a way to have a conversation that not only, I'm interested in how you begin to get the media to receive a different story, but I would also like the insight of these bodies of work to actually have an impact on my profession as well, because journalists are certainly part of common humanity, even though people don't seem to remember that much anymore.
I think you're so right. This idea of the moral injury that journalists experience often, whether it's covering, you know, inner city situations, which you've done so eloquently. When I was a journalist, I covered conflict, and coming back, it was difficult to talk about, you know, and really damaging. Thank you.
May I just say, I also think, and this I just think would be useful in the ongoing discussions about the media, is to recognize too that the people that are moving in between the stories and the actual outlets for the stories, you know, sometimes I would feel much closer to the people I was writing about than the places where I was publishing work. And there's a whole, you know, there are a lot of different locations that I think there aren't as many clear, safe harbors, I think, when you get down to it sometimes, because you know what, as you become a more seasoned journalist, you know the business that you're involved in is much more out of your control than you think at first.
Very much so. I actually want to go to Stefan.
Yes.
Could you talk about, I want to kind of fast forward a little bit, talk about the concept of moral injury and its relevance to your work.
I'm just slightly intimidating that the man who came up with that is sitting right there. But it actually ties into what I'm even doing here, because for me the moral injury is steeped in mythology, or the myths that we're told, or as we've been discussing in the PACH meetings, you call it false stories. I just call it the myth. Excuse me. And God, 10 gallons through a 1 gallon hose. So forgive me here. I'm trying to sort this out. But I'm here because I'm a military veteran and now an actor, Shakespeare actor. And the leap to those isn't as broad as you would think. And the reason I'm both of those things and that I'm here is because of moral injury. And using theater, literally, Tina Packer's work at Shakespeare and Company, the pedagogy that they use for classical actor training has combated my post-traumatic stress symptoms. And I've used that to help other veterans. And as this grows, we find all of these other facets that it helps. I have a one-man show that is just this, professing how I met Richard III. Yeah, Shakespeare's Richard III, but it really was. My best friend, and I love moral injury, in many ways, besides my wife, your book, Achilles in Vietnam, just this year, brought me back from the brink of suicide again, suicidal thoughts. That in conjunction with the month-long intensive. I keep pointing there because that's Tina Packer there. She created it. For 40 years has been doing this work that, lo and behold, I thought I was stumbling across, that no one else had discovered. And turns out the Greeks were doing it 4,000 years ago and the Chinese before that, but you know, whatever. This is about me right now. But with that, I realized all of the myths that caused me to join the military, and then realized that once I was in the military, the myths that were perpetuated and capitalized on to continue the work in the military, and I was having doubts while I was in the military already, when, after I survived infantry officers basic course, Ranger school, countless schools, I was in the, I don't say this in a form of boasting, I say this so you understand at what level I was operating. I was in the top 2% of all company grade officers for all 4 branches in the U.S. military. I was going airborne, air assault, Ranger, I'm in the top 2%. Survived the first Gulf War, I didn't do anything. We were circling in a plane overhead while it all went down. I thought, thank goodness, I made it. I figured we got about 10 years before we go to war again. Because when I went in, I wanted to kill somebody. I really did. I was angry, and by this point, about 6, 7 years in, I was like, yeah, not so much anymore. And my best friend was shot in training in the face, right across from me to James away. And something broke. And that's when I saw the Shakespeare play. I saw Richard III, and I'd never seen a Shakespeare play. And I have what I call in my show the Ghostbusters moment, where they say, don't cross the streams, otherwise every molecule in your body will explode at the speed of light. And that's what happened to me, is the best way I can describe it. And then through the past 16 years of doing this work, of specifically the performing arts, which require collaboration with each other and require that actor-audience relationship, I was reconnected to my humanity and to other people's humanities. And so I was really terrified that I'd lost it for forever, because when I went into graduate school, I wasn't right. And I don't know that I'm right now. Actually, I know I'm not. But I'm accepting that it's okay to not be okay, is what I'm getting at. So that's what brings me here, is to get in the room with incredible thinkers like yourselves and try and break down the barriers that the industrial age and amongst other things have created between psychiatry, right? In the Greeks, it was theater, theology, and therapy were all theater, therapy, and theology were all together, right? And now it's, well, that's the math building, that's the science building, that's where they do plays, and they can't be in the same building where they do music because apparently they're different. So I'm trying to tear down all those walls literally so that we work together to try and reconnect us on a deeper level, which I think we were originally. Did that make any sense at all?
It did. Thank you, Stefan. Khary, from your perspective, and I'm asking this question because I've heard you talk about it so eloquently. From your perspective, how do you identify the types of humanity, the levels of humanity when we talk about common humanity? How do you recognize different humanities or elements of humanity?
Well, I think that when we start talking about humanity, that just jumping off a little bit of what you're also asking others in terms of why I've come to this conversation, is because I think personally, and then in the work that I do, we believe that there's this intersection of humanities, that they don't exist in silos, they don't exist in separate spaces, but that if we're really trying to get at the core solutions for the kind of issues that so many people have talked about already in the first 2 times we've come together and written about, that the answers lie in the intersection of humanities, that we've sought answers for too long in isolated, segmented ways. And then we look at the major issues that we're now facing and that I face in my work with young people, that they're completely interconnected. And so you can't deal with issues of gender and issues of sexism and misogyny of women talking to girls, right? We all know that. Men have to talk to boys, and you have to talk cross-gender, and you have to have an analysis that moves into every space. When we talk about the inequities we continue to face around race and class, again, the only way we can find these solutions is if humanity sees the solutions as everyone's responsibility. You know, every day, you know, I'm confronted with what I continue to see as gross inequities in our global community, but in a very isolated way also here in New York and in Harlem. And so the inhumanity that the children I work with in Harlem face every day, you know, I really see as an abomination. I see it as a stain on New York City, a stain on the country. The problem is that their humanity has been seen as their lack of humanity, that those two pieces have come together for so long. It's okay that they're at failing schools because they're poor black and brown children. It's okay that they every day are terrified of violence even if they don't experience the violence because they're poor black and brown children. It's okay that the unemployment rate for black males is hovering at 50% right now in the city because of issues of race. And so if we're trying to tackle these issues, there has to be an understanding that the solutions have to be global. And so what we try to talk to our young people about all the time is that their humanity is connected to others. Sometimes it's the injured, I think, who are the first to recognize and see that. So yes, you face all these inconsistencies, all these oppressions, this kind of suffocating sense that you can't get out, and you have to get out, but you also have to understand your connection to others' humanity. And so we're talking about wars in other parts of the world that America's declared. We're talking about issues of, you know, masculinity and issues of misogyny. We're talking about issues of homophobia. We're talking about issues of violence. We're trying to counter at times every lesson they're learning in their home environment, in their school environment, sometimes, you know, in the community as well. And so when I think of humanity, that's why we do the work at Brotherhood Sister Soul. It's why we feel we're kind of at the forefront, really in a, and I use this word cautiously because I know that there are people who have been in actual war. But our young people at times feel that that's what their circumstances are, that every day they're afraid of violence. Every day they feel their lives are in danger. Every day they feel like they don't really have any access to following their dreams because they're just in survival mode. That is not the same thing as being in the middle of a war zone, but the trauma that comes from it, the ramification of it is profound and deep. And so part of why I would come to this conversation is I think that we're always looking for solutions. We feel like we really understand the depth of the problem, the inhumanity we all continue to perpetuate and face, that people can go about, quote, their lives while you have 25% of the people in this borough surviving off of $9,000 a year or less in Manhattan. That people go about their lives while 700,000 children are at risk of failure in the school system and 400,000 will more than likely fail, meaning not graduate from high school with a 61% graduation rate. And so when we look at that, I think we're constantly trying to understand what solutions can be. And so, you know, just kind of as a closing thought, it reminds me of the fact that we use a lot of folk tales and proverbs with our young people. It's a way of storytelling that I think storytelling has often played a core part of developing humanity. Getting people to understand another person's story is often a way of understanding his or her experience. And there's an old proverb or adage that's, you know, that's told that there's a group of people on the banks of a river. And they're enjoying the day and they're enjoying the river and the sun. And all of a sudden they have the horrific vision of a child floating down the river. And somebody dives in the water to save the child and they pull the child out. And just as they're trying to figure out, you know, what happened and why the child's in the water, they see a second child. And another person jumps in and the woman grabs the child and swims out and brings the child out. And at that point, two of the people in the group run away from the group. And the group starts screaming at those two people and says, you know, what are you doing? Where are you going? You know, we need your help right here. And they said, we're running up a river to find out who the hell is throwing our children in the water.
Thank you, Khary. Okay. I didn't forget you, Jim. I actually have two questions for you. The first is, that framing question I've been asking everyone. What brought you to PACH? What about PACH attracted you in terms of the work you're doing, your experiences? But the second part of the question, Jim, I want to ask, from your perspective, what are the benefits or interest in not seeing a common humanity?
Okay, thank you. Let me just start by saying that I really was very skeptical about this group when I first heard about it. I was not at all convinced it was a good idea. The reason was because the phrase "Project for a Common Humanity" reminded me of the famous story about Calvin Coolidge when he went to church one Sunday and came home, and his wife asked him what happened. He said, well, the preacher gave a sermon, and she said, what was it about? He said, sin. She said, well, what did he have to say about it? He said, he was against it. And I thought the Project for a Common Humanity could easily sound like, well, we're against sin. Well, of course, who isn't against sin? But I want to make the point that there are a lot of people who are against our common humanity and the whole idea of commonness. After all, the word common comes linguistically, etymologically, from the same roots as the word community and communal. I think here of Jonathan's comment about the communalization of trauma, and the word communism. And, all you have to do is to be for our common humanity in order to be accused of being a communist. We see that in our current political debate, but it's been going on for a long time. I mean, there's a famous story about the Archbishop of El Salvador who commented, when I said we should give alms to the poor, I was called a good Christian. When I asked why we have poverty, I was called a communist. And that's what we are going to be up against. Some of you may remember in the last electoral campaign when there was a big debate about Obamacare, people supporting Obamacare were actually being given death threats. I mean, there were people who were that strongly opposed to the idea that everybody should have a common access and equal access to something as necessary for life as health care. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But that is what happens. Now, what do I mean by being open to our common humanity? I think of the motto that Dostoevsky put in the mouth of one of the great characters in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima, the priest monk, comes up with the motto, that is meaning all human beings, are responsible for all. That is, we are all responsible for each other. To me, that's what is meant by a common humanity. Now, I've often said that if there's any validity to what I'm saying, you can read about it in this morning's newspaper. So let me quote from a recent New Yorker, a letter objecting to an article which had given an example of a reasonably prosperous man who in his early 30s or 40s did not have health insurance and got very sick and had huge health bills. They drove him into bankruptcy. He lost his home, his business. He was subsisting on food stamps. And so this letter comes in saying this article was just, absurd, saying, we do not, as a society, have a duty to protect people like the man in this story. Protecting individuals from their own irresponsible behavior is not a duty of the Affordable Care Act or the function of government generally. I mean, now that's a real statement, I think, of people who don't believe we have a common humanity or should act as if we do. Now, I don't think we can discuss this issue without talking about politics, because politics is the arena in which we solve problems communally, problems that cannot be solved at a smaller level. I'm reminded of something that the great Italian political scientist Norberto Bobbio said in a book he wrote on left-wing versus right-wing politics. And he said the essence of left-wing politics is the value on equality. Right-wing politics supports inequality, supports hierarchy and class status differences and so forth. In America, this battle has been fought out, the left versus right wing, mostly in our two-party system by the Republicans versus the Democrats. Franklin Roosevelt said once that we can test our progress as a nation not by how much we give to those who already have much, but by what we do for those who have too little. I mean, he was pushing for a common humanity where everybody counted, the poor as well as the rich. By contrast, I'd say the iconic representative of the Republican Party was Ronald Reagan when he said, our party, the Republican Party, wants to see an America in which it's always possible for somebody to get rich. Meaning, you know, but you're not rich unless, by comparison with somebody who's poor. I mean, it means you're pushing to support the rich. So they've become the party of inequality. So I'm saying I think that if this group is going to accomplish something, we're going to have to take on political issues. People may disagree with the way I would frame some of this. I would hope that some of what I'm saying might even just stimulate a debate, because there is room for disagreement on these things. But I would push for the notion that we can't pretend that politics isn't at the heart of the question of a common humanity. And that's one reason why I would support this group as a kind of think tank, as a kind of collective research and writing and thinking group, comparable to, but very different from, the dozens of extremely well-funded right-wing think tanks, which for the last 30 to 40 years have been dominating the American political debate, setting the terms of the debate. I think it's time for us to set the terms of the debate, and I would like to see this group do this. I mean, we have such a riches of academic and intellectual and moral force, I think, with this group. So I would push, you know, I mean, as a physician, I read a lot about and I support evidence-based medicine. I think it's time that we really created a think tank that would support evidence-based politics. And I'd like to see us do that.
Thank you, Jim. That's good. This idea of false ideas or false identities that we tell ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about how that fits into the work that you're doing?
I mean, there's so much that we are taught to believe is a true part of our so-called nature that is actually a betrayal of who we can become. And I think a lot of my work, what draws me to do the kind of research I do, is trying to expose, I guess they are false stories, that really tell us the ways that we can allow certain people to express their humanities, and other people, we are told we shouldn't have compassion for them. Their humanity is kept invisible, right? So in this country, the belief that if you just work hard enough, you'll be one of the people who matters, and the reason you feel you don't matter is because you didn't work hard enough to become one of us, and so you can be invisible, right? We don't need to even acknowledge your humanity. I mean, there's so many things I can think of in my research. I guess one of the recent ones, which I think connects to a lot of what we've been saying about what's so very wrong with literally systems that we have in place, is a lot of my work is in homelessness shelters, domestic violence shelters. And if a woman goes through a DV shelter and wants to qualify for housing assistance, even if she's coming from a DV shelter directly, she needs to prove that there's been abuse so that she can qualify for subsidized housing, transitional housing as a DV survivor. And what that means is that she has to go to the Department of Homelessness Services, DHS, and explain, I've been abused, therefore I have nowhere to go. I can't go back to the home where I left because that's where the abuser is. And the system is such that you have to sit with a worker and tell your story. The problem is that you have to come and sometimes wait 3 full days before you get your turn, and you have your kids with you usually, and they don't have a separate space for your kids to be while you're being interviewed. So you can see this all playing out, right? One of the women, and this is a very common story, now they've actually started talking to the women who we work with about this, but one of the first stories a woman was telling me that so many of us, in deciding to leave our abusers, decided, I'm gonna tell my child some other reason, because so many of them didn't let their kids know that their dad was beating them. They didn't, a lot of them had fathers where there's violence, like they didn't want to grow up with this idea of this is what a father is, and so they would say, for instance, daddy is left, we're leaving, we can't live here anymore, and they would be vague about it. So one of the women who was telling me the story said that, and then there I was with my young daughter being interviewed and being asked, what is the evidence that you were abused? Tell specific instances, and it was extreme. It was extreme battering, it was extreme rape at the hands of her husband, and it was over the course of years. It was always after their daughter's bedtime at night, so she didn't know about it. And she protected her daughter from knowing about it. That's an understandable lie. But then with the daughter sitting there and her having to listen to the mother describe the abuse, and this is what the abuser did, her daughter asked her, when was this happening? And she said, oh, well, it was at night. It was happening when you were asleep in your bed. And she said, but who was it who was coming into our home at night and doing this? And the fact that this mother had to sit there and say, this was your daddy doing all of these things to me, shows us that we feel some people's humanity matters, and the humanity of this mother and her child does not matter. They are poor, they're homeless, you got yourself into this situation. How can we use power that we have collectively to allow stories to be told from the lives of people who can teach us so much, which is a lot of us who do this sort of research, this is what we try to do, be vehicles for the people we work with. But also understand that we need to do something wherever we can. So we're now working with a representative from Department of Homeless Services, my research team and I, to advocate with the people who actually are directors of homeless shelters that if you run a DV shelter, you need to say that my word should be enough. I discharged this woman to you, and we had to go through a screening for her to come here and be at a DV shelter. That should be enough, as opposed to her having to wait 3 days to tell a story and to have to tell the story in front of her child. So to me, I feel that that's sort of the bigger picture as I see it.
Adrian, as a journalist, I would almost say as an anthropological journalist, how do you see yourself, or how do you see your role in, I guess, addressing these challenges that we're talking about around common humanity, the falsehoods, the false stories, the moral injury that often the disenfranchised endure. As a journalist, what strategies do you bring to these issues?
Well, I guess on a subject sort of similar to what you're talking about, just in the course of my brief career in terms of pitching stories to publications, for example, it used to be fairly easy to sell, say, a poverty story, as it would be called. And then it would be, you could do it less frequently. And then it was more like I'm using gross generalizations, but it would be like an annual thing, because the readership, the demographics of the readership, are people are highly aware of who their readers are and the assumptions about who's reading and what they care about, which are also, I think, could use with some evidence-based practices, because I think they always are underestimating what readers can respond to. But I just found I had to keep improvising strategies to try to get to the stories that were also becoming more complicated for me. So whereas I might initially be interested in wanting to write about the outrageousness of that, I would now be curious to know about issues of complicity and negotiating strategies that are adaptable, and then what the consequences are further down the road. But anyway, the subjects of the stories had to keep getting younger and younger in order to be innocent. So I used to be able to write about juveniles, and now poverty can almost only be told on the back of a child protagonist. It's very difficult to write stories about adults in poverty because the constant question of the choices that they're making. So I've developed ways into questions. For example, this project I'm working on about stand-up comedians now is really in part motivated by watching practitioners who are trying to convey provocative truth, how they negotiate that give and take with live audiences night after night after night. Like, how do you get people to hear a very disturbing truth with the high artists among them? How do you literally get people to hear you out? And then to extract some of those skills. But I do constantly, and I think even among the conversations here, I'm highly attuned to the fix that people seem to get by hearing and narrating the most extreme damage, of which I myself have participated in as a journalist, absolutely. And I've often wondered, why is it that people sort of go for the extreme story in a way? You have to. I mean, you have to sort of get people to pay attention. But I think some of it, over time, it struck me that it is a function of people not listening, so that you have to keep screaming, look, this is how bad it gets, and you have to sort of go down into the thing, whereas in a way, so much of the utility of what you're talking about as an example would be a story about how you actually go about changing that, and that would be a useful thing to read about for a lot of people who care about the subject, right? But to get that story told, you have to get people to comprehend what it means for a woman in that moment. You know what I mean? So you're constantly between these things. So I feel I look for kindred spirits who, people that are willing to hear out the messiness of it. But I guess I don't really have any. I think I'm here partly because I've run out of. I'm very concerned. I don't think it's an argument anymore. I'm sort of thinking, I think it's a paradigm shift. It's not like making the right pitch or getting it. It's actually the whole thing has to change because I'm out of. Because now that 12-year-olds are involved in school shootings, I mean, I don't know how much younger you can, it's just going to be it's just an impossible thing. So I think that's part of what's, I don't think I answered your question. I think I just restated the problem in detail. I think.
No, but and I recognize the complexity, especially being a journalist, what you're facing.
And then the pressures that, who readers are, and I think it's a real great opportunity now with all the things that are going on in media to really find ways to get things out there that have different gatekeepers or no gatekeepers at all.
Thank you, Adrian. That's great. As a soldier and a veteran, is the idea of a common humanity, is that something that can coexist with your responsibilities?
Can it coexist with the responsibilities to kill each other? Probably not. And which is why they spend so much time and money on training. It's not, and it doesn't begin with basic training either. There's an incredible book by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman called On Killing. And he covers our efficiency of killing. And it's actually really, really inefficient. They go back to even the Revolutionary War where they find multiple balls. That's when they had to load the bullet. It was a ball at the top of the barrel, right? Muzzle loaders, they call them. Right? So they had to put it through the top. And what they found were not a few dozen, but hundreds upon hundreds of weapons with multiple balls stacked on top of them. What they discerned was that these were men not firing at the other men. And then when we look at the number of bullets fired for the number of people killed, they discerned that we have about an efficiency rate of about 5 to 15% killing rate. And this number varies on how much we actually dehumanize the enemy. So for example, the only time we've gotten that number higher, and the highest we've gotten it in recorded history, is 50%, just under 50%. And that was in the Pacific Theater in World War II against the Japanese, where we had a clearly different looking enemy, right, and clearly different uniforms. We were able to convince or dehumanize that enemy much more so than the Germans, who were also Caucasian, who were, right, and the likeliness of, or the distance was less, if you will. So they have to capitalize on creating a distance. And what this suggests is that it can't, that we have to get rid of this humanity. We have to create enough distance. And what I propose in my personal theory, of how this all works is that it begins at a very young age. I believe that we cultivate a crop of draftees in this nation. You've probably heard the term draft by poverty. It's self-explanatory if you don't, but that really only accounts for about 70% of the people that enlist or draft. There's another quarter that have to go in for not economic reasons, and they're going in for pride, self-respect, right? Courage, honor, all of these things that we're not getting. I didn't serve with a bunch of men and women who are from healthy, wealthy, well-adjusted families. We were mostly escaping low-income families, violent families, hometowns that we despised, and so on and so forth. Wanted to do something honorable, wanted to gain self-respect, all of these different things. And those the proof of this, by the way, I just want to throw this out. 73% of the casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan are from low-income families. So there's my evidence-based data, if you will. That number, unfortunately, stays roughly the same whether we have a draft or not. In the Vietnam War, it was around 60% low-income families, right? Even with the and think of the distance we had with Iraq and Afghanistan with this whole patriotism and nationalism thing. You can tell how I feel about the isms, right? But people were joining because never forget 9/11. And yet still 73% are from low-income families. So that's what I'm saying is we cultivate a crop. We have a draft by culture, as I would call it. And then once we get in, we're rewired. It starts with basic training. All branches have 8 weeks of basic training. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all 4 do basic training where they dehumanize us. They shave our heads. We're all cue balls. We all wear uniforms. We are no longer individuals. We're part of a unit. We are uniform in our dress, uniform in our speaking, everything. And then they wire us for war. And then at the end, where my work comes in, is at the end of that training. And this is years. And it's at, as you say in your book, Dr. Shay, at a highly malleable age, right? Years. Think of it. The minimum service is 2 years, minimum. 2 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of distancing the enemy, firing at a silhouette that's just shaped like a human being, so that's not a human being. So the distancing, and then the real problem comes in at the end of service. They don't undo that distancing. They don't suddenly rehumanize other human beings. They just dump us back into the community. So whether we've been berserkered, as you talk about in the book, or not, we're all a little off, as I put it. We all have a little something going on. And then we're just dumped back in our communities. So that's what to answer your question, no. No, we cannot.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Khary, from the work that you're doing with Black and Brown youth, what are some of the strategies that you see we could be doing to address moral injury and these falsehoods?
I think that there are lessons in history for those of us who see ourselves as part of a kind of progressive vision. We all use different terminology for it, but more humanist vision. And I think we've lost sight of some of those efforts. And I feel that when we start talking about the work, that I've engaged with, I, often use as an example when we're talking about organizers. We train youth to be organizers, to seek to develop the skills to create change in their own community. And we use a lot of different types of, stories from history and examples from history. And we often say that young people are the most often talked about, least heard from constituency, right? Where are the youth voices? Youth voices were at the forefront of the women's movement, gay and lesbian movement, anti-war movement, brought down a president. But a core example we use is the civil rights movement. And when you look at the effort to end segregation and to ensure one person, one vote in the country, you saw 4 efforts that were concerted and were long-term, right? This didn't happen in one speech in Washington. It didn't happen with 10 years of work, but it happened over decades and decades of litigation, running hand in hand with organizing, running hand in hand with policy work, and running hand in hand with media work. Those 4 pieces had to come together. You had to have an integrated approach. And while the litigation strategy was 40 to 50 years, right? And any student of constitutional law can see the stepping stones to reach Brown v. Board, that at the same time policy efforts were going on. And at the same time, certain people in the country would not have been moved if they had not seen dogs attacking children. That was an intentional decision, right? And so what I think we've lost sight of in the progressive movement, in a movement for a greater sense of humanity, is how these four things run together. And so that's the organizing model we've tried to teach our young people. And so when we're talking to young people about their humanity, it's not just about the laws we want to seek to change, but we've worked on those. So we've been very involved in the anti-stop and frisk work, and our young people have been some of the lead voices around reforming stop and frisk in the city, litigants. We've written amicus brief. You know, we've submitted assorted documents to the court. So one part was litigation and for them to be aware of it. The second was organizing, for them to take to the streets and organize people so that people understood how broad this was an issue. The third, as I mentioned, was media. You know, the definitive first-person piece by a young person stopped and frisked was written by Nicholas Pert, op-ed in the New York Times, Why is the NYPD after me, one of our alumni members. And Nicholas has this very powerful line when he's now talked about this issue in every media space in the US, major media space, German TV, Japanese TV, Brazilian TV. It's become like comical in the office where the next country is going to be calling from. And he says whenever he's talking about this issue to the audience, when you see my face, see the face of your own child, right? And he brings a humanism to it that it's not the other. It's that he's walking to the store and he's put down on the street at gunpoint. It's that he's out on his 18th birthday and the police put him on the street with a gun to the back of his head, and when they see his ID and it's his birthday, they drop the ID on his back and wish him a happy birthday, right? The inhumanity of that moment, he tells those stories. And then we're working on a policy level, and we're working to, you know, advise and push the conversation from City Hall to the City Council to the District Attorney's Office. There are many who worked on that issue, but again, we're using it as an example of the incredible concerted effort that needs to happen, and I think that those of us in the progressive movement have to take on to seek change in any of our spaces, whatever the space may be. Because I think what we're running up against are these false stories that are so profoundly entrenched, right? You know, I'm an attorney, and I remember when I first really came face to face with this concept of originalism, the idea that the original intent of the United States Constitution and its framers should drive us today. And this is the core kind of right-wing philosophy of constitutional law. And yet when these documents were written, of course, it was only, you know, white men with property who were empowered. Women had no power, Latin people had no power, Native Americans, poor white folks, and certainly black people who are 3/5 of a human being in these constitutions. Yet we're told, in the Constitution, yet we're told that's the narrative and the framework we're working within. When we look at the narrative around the Founding Fathers, I mean, this may seem a long time ago, but if you continue to elevate people, and every Founding Father other than John Adams owned human people, trafficked in human people, right? Owned their own children. I don't know what could be more barbaric than that. I think that kind of story does two things. One, it creates in the people who were not written into those documents a fundamental disconnect, you know, what the boys talked about, the two-ness, a disconnect from society. But it also does profound disservice, I think, to the progressive voice. All the white folks who were abolitionists, who were Quakers, who were standing up in Congress and speaking out against the inhumanity of slavery. Instead, the narrative becomes, this is what the Constitution was about, because this is what the country was about, and this is what power was about, and this is what it was built on, and we should all celebrate it. And that's one of many, obviously, incoherent stories. But the stories have staying power today. And you know, a proverb that we often use with our young people is that when, you know, when lions have their own historians, hunters will cease being heroes, right? And so the entire perspective changes via what the lens is that you bring to the conversation. And so when we're talking about war, and we're talking about Afghanistan, and we're talking about Iraq with our young people, we published a curriculum called Why Did This Happen? And that was because on 9/11, as Manhattan fell under attack and buildings were falling and people were dying by the thousands, our young people came to our building and said, why did this happen? And we realized that in that moment, this was when the rubber hit the road. You know, my co-founder was down on Wall Street running from the clouds of smoke, right? A couple more blocks and who knows what occurs. It was very personal. It was personal to people who had family members who worked in those buildings. But we had to talk about the fact that we had a shared common humanity with people in these countries. And so as we thought about what the future would bring, we had to open the conversation up in a way that included for the young people a space to vent, yes, a space to be angry, as many were, but also a space to understand the complexity of international geopolitics and war.
Jim, I want to bring the question to you. I've been asking the others. Strategies for responding to these issues we're talking about, moral injury and falsehoods, from your perspective.
Well, I think, again, this room is filled with people who each have real expertise in a wide variety of different areas. The field I've concentrated in has been the investigations into the causes and prevention of violence, and I've used jails and prisons as, you might say, my social psychological laboratories in which to study that. There are a huge variety of ways, though, that I would say in my area that I've at least attempted to reach a public audience. One was simply by publishing articles and books, by participating in interviews on radio and television, and being involved in making documentary films, writing blogs for the Huffington Post and other places, giving public lectures. I mean, doing that whole range of things. But the most effective thing actually has been testifying in court, because my experience has been that the only time we've made real progress in the criminal justice system and in eliminating some of the worst practices and some of the most self-defeating practices has been when judges order cities or states to make those changes, because people who are dependent on getting elected to office, whether it's in the executive branch or the legislative branch of city, state, or federal governments, are terrified that they'll be accused of being soft on crime if they engage in anything in the area of prison reform or reform in the criminal justice system. So I spend more time talking to lawyers and judges than I do to my fellow psychiatrists, because that's the forum in which I've been able to really get change. I mean, for example, one thing you read about in the newspaper every few days now is this, the Supreme Court's ruling that the state of California has to reduce the overcrowding in the prisons there, because as I and my fellow expert witnesses were able to show in this litigation, one prisoner in California was dying every 5 or 6 days from inadequate medical and mental health care, because the prisons were so overcrowded that the doctor's offices were even being used as bedrooms. I mean, there was no place to provide treatment. And not only that, they were ordered to reduce the population of the prisons by 40,000 people. At least that many people suffering from severe mental illnesses in the prisons and shouldn't have been in the prisons to begin with. They should have been in the mental health system. A majority of people there were in for nonviolent crimes. So you could release 80,000 people from that system without really endangering the public. And I mean, I could go on and on. But, and I've been involved in dozens of lawsuits like that. So that's a place where you can. But again, this is going to vary for each of you with what is your own area of expertise and interest as to how you can begin to make change. These are all little changes, a step at a time. If I really wanted to say what I would really like to have happen, I would like to have us just, well, let me put it this way. I think it would benefit every man, woman, and child in America if we took the prisoners out of the prisons and jails and demolished those buildings and then replaced them with an entirely new architectural model. The model of the jails and prisons now is based on a model that zoos had to give up decades ago because they realized the animals were dying when they were simply put in concrete cages with bars on the walls. So now zoo animals are put in zoological parks, which is what they were evolved to adapt to and survive in. We still put human beings in cages that no zookeeper would be allowed to put animals in. And then we act surprised in a very disingenuous way when the people in them behave like animals. I mean, we say, oh, well, then that's why we should have treated them this way. So it's a self-defeating policy. So I would abolish the prisons and replace them with locked, secure schools, colleges, universities, therapeutic communities to provide medical care, substance abuse treatment, psychiatric treatment, even dental care. I mean, you have no idea the degree of deprivation and neglect that the people in the prisons have suffered from infancy on. You know, it could go on and on. The economic system. I think it's time we stopped simply wanting to have equality of opportunity. We do need equality of outcome. There's no equality of opportunity when one child can inherit $1 million and most children inherit nothing. Until we have equality of outcome, where I think inheritance taxes should be 100%. I think we should have a maximum wage as well as a minimum wage. I think we should equalize. You know, I think we should equalize. So what I'm saying is, I would hope to start a controversy and a debate and to say some things that are really polemical, because I think if this group can't do it, who in hell can?
Thank you. If I may, there's a question I want to ask based on something Jim said earlier, which it's been marinating in my mind. And I'll ask Alisha the question. Is the notion of common humanity apolitical?
It's an interesting question to ask as psychologists, because we're told that we have to be thinking as scientists, and that if we are truly objective scientists, then the political has nothing to do with the work that we do. And I believe that we can't tell the stories that we need to be the storytellers of in our science unless we think always about the political realities that shape people's lives, right? And so I feel that when we talk about the way that people suffer psychologically and how that's connected to all the other sorts of suffering that people live through, as psychologists, as social scientists, we can't only talk about suffering. We have to say, why is this here and how is this imposed? Because more often than we think, it was imposed on someone against their will. I mean, even I do mental health research, so I mean, in deference to the psychiatrist here, the number of stories that I hear from people I interview about the fact that they're suffering and they're told that psychotropic drugs is the most effective, this is the best way, and this is the answer. And it's getting younger and younger. So those of us who teach here at NYU, I mean, a decade ago, we didn't really see incoming freshmen who had been on psychiatric medication since they were in middle school. We're seeing it now. And they're moving away from home and they're here and they don't know what to do with themselves. You know, do they fill their medication? Do they go off and try and see how they are without it? Younger and younger kids. There was a child who I was interviewing when I was talking to a family that the child had been diagnosed with ADHD. He was 6 going on 7. And he'd known that he'd been naughty and doing bad things. He'd be sent to his room for bad behavior for years. But the way he explained it to me is that he said, Mom and Dad always told me that you're not bad, but you do things that are bad and it's not good for other people or for you. So we need to listen to these experts because they're wise and they really can help you and they can help us. And he said, now I know that I take a pill and I understand now everything's changed. This is a kid who's not even yet 7. He said, I know now that it wasn't the doing that was bad, it was the me that was bad. Because I take the pill and the me goes away and the bad goes away. So he has been told, he has been forced to swallow a false story literally every night at bedtime, right? He has to live a false story. What happens 15 years from now when Niobe or me or Carol has him in our graduate seminar on mental health? What can I tell him? I can tell him that you have come out of a system that is broken and that is morally broken because what's been done to you is unjust. So I can tell it as a psychologist, as a human story, or I could tell it as a scientist who sees everything, I mean everything through a political lens. So I think that we can't separate the two. I think that it's a mistake for us to try because then what we're saying is, but that's only personal. That's just one person's story. And that's the trap that we so often fall into. So I think that it's the system that's broken.
Thank you, Alisha. Stefan, can you answer that same question?
I I'm still thinking of the 6-year-old taking the medication. Can you, what was the exact question again?
Is the notion of a common humanity apolitical?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I absolutely do, because I mean because politics becomes politics uses tools, and politicians use tools and in memes and all of that. What we're talking about is something, again, like I said, that we've known. That human beings we've known. When we look at the cave paintings that are 40,000 years old, those, in my opinion, are about our common humanity, sharing stories, and teaching, giving the lion story in the painting, giving the lion his chance or her chance to speak on the cave wall. So that had nothing to. There was no Democrats or Republicans then, and even now when we're talking about humanity, and just like there are no atheists in a foxhole. I mean, I didn't get along with most of the guys I served with, but when we're in the field, there's no Republicans, no politicians, no, it's just my brother. You've got my right flank, I've got your left flank, you got the point, you know what I mean? So, and that's I bring up the military because it's the most base I think we can get. It's both the extremes of humanity, both the very best of us and the very worst of us in that controlled little environment of war. And as long as I have the microphone, can I do one more thing? Because just because I wrote it down, I have to share. I wrote because when you were talking about the myths or the false stories, I started writing them down, and I didn't realize how much of my life was based on these, because this was thanks to you all here at PACH that I even thought of this. I mean, I knew that the military capitalized on this, but I wrote these 8, and I just had to share them, if you don't mind, really quickly. The myths, as they pertain to what we're talking about, and specifically with my work. Here are the lies what I consider lies that I were told that got me to this point. 1, war and violence are part of human nature. I was taught that my whole life. It's not true. 2, the military has 3 functions. It defends our freedom and democracy, which once I got in realized meant killing human beings, other human beings, not Taliban, not Hajis, not VC, human beings, but we don't call them that. So, but we call that defending our freedom. It also is where I can earn pride, dignity, and self-respect. So you can imagine when I read James's article and book, how that leapt out at me, that prisoners are saying this exact same thing. And that this is where I can break my cycle of my family's poverty. But if you know anything about the military income, it's also a lie. The VA will fix any people that are broken that the military breaks, and will take care of all veterans. That was another lie I was told. The perfect family exists. That was a lie I was told, and therefore keep any of our flaws secret. That was what I was told. And these were all contributing factors to me going in the military, is why I say this. America is the best nation in the world, and everyone wants to be an American or in America, right? And these two go together. Finally, might is right, right? That strength is big, it's brawny, and it's powerful, and it's masculine, and everything else is feminine, and weakness, emotions, all of that is weak and bad. And finally, the arts, because I wanted to be a dancer since as early as I can remember. The arts are at best, and this is an actual term actually what I was told as a kid. The arts are at best a useless hobby that women, gay men, and weak hippie commies do. That was an actual quote that I wrote from when I was a kid. So, so I want to do that just because since I had the mic, I wanted to share that because that then explains what I think we should do. What you didn't ask, but I'm going to offer what I think we should do after we do James's plan of what we can do forward. Is I believe that the performing arts specifically, and I mean dance, music, theater, should be taught at all levels. It should have as equal importance as math, science, the athletics, All of those, it should be equally funded, given equal time from K all the way up through our work that we continue to do. And this is not just some, oh, it's lovely, because they've proven it, that math scores improve when we do music, right? Communication skills obviously improve when we do theater, amongst many, many other things. Take a month-long intensive at Shakespeare and Company with Tina and see how your life changes, literally. And in Los Angeles, where I moved from, they're working with kids from South Central Los Angeles. The graduation rate from making it from freshman year to senior year is less than 30%, and I think only 10 or 15% of those graduate, but they do Shakespeare play with them. One Shakespeare play, and they pay them above minimum wage. They change that by 90%. 90% of the kids who participate, who do a Shakespeare play, who didn't even, the way I was when I first saw it, make it to the senior year, and of that 90%, over 90% graduate. So that's what I think we should do. Shakespeare. Thank you. Thank you for letting me ramble.
Of course, thank you. Dr. Shay, would you be comfortable making a few remarks for us?
First of all, this has been an incredibly rich panel, and there's just so much to both take in and digest and respond to. I'm just going to throw random fragments out there that it seems to me we're definitely talking in the political territory. First of all, in the words of Judith Herman, a towering figure in the trauma field, that trauma always emerges from the ecology of power. Period, net no discount. And so any definition of the political by a sociologist, by a political scientist, an anthropologist, always says that the political as a category is about power and its use in society among and between human beings, and all of the stuff that goes with it, the way it's legitimated, the way it's celebrated, etc., etc., etc. So it becomes a self-refuting proposition to be a detached, apolitical scientist, whether of the social science stripe or the psychological science type or the biological science type, examining trauma without examining power. So it's a formula for irrelevancy. It's a formula for being what Lenin and Stalin used to call the useful idiots. That is the scholars, scientists, journalists who would find either knowingly or unwittingly ways to legitimate the power structure that Stalin ran. I worry that my work with the military has been, at least in part, window dressing, that I was regarded as a useful idiot. I have no way of knowing, and I try to always speak the truth and to get to know people well enough that they're willing to trust me to tell me the truth. And I cannot gauge for myself how well I succeed. Anyway, just random stuff that floated into my mind is Lincoln's amazing words, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." Boom. Another thing that I wanted to say is that a core meaning of citizenship, I think pretty much anywhere where this word matters to people, and admittedly what defines a citizen has been profoundly flawed in different places, different times. It remains flawed in this country as an on-the-ground operational fact. But that once within that frame, there is a basic thing about citizenship, and that is that you look other citizens in the eye and you say, you are part of my future and I am part of yours. And that is, there's the Stoic, ultimately the Stoic idea of cosmopolitan citizenship, being a citizen of the world, where we regard every human on this planet, and some people would extend it to all species on this planet, but to be able to say that if there is a child in Zimbabwe who is dying of a treatable illness, this diminishes my welfare, my well-being, even if there is literally zero probability of us ever meeting. So that's the ethical side of it, but on the scientific side, I really desperately want to beat the drum for an expansive image of what the human critter is. What we're doing at this moment is physiological. Everybody is a body, but it's also at every moment psychological. And it is also at every moment social. And at every moment it is cultural. And none of these four, brain/body, mind, society, and culture, is ontologically prior and superior to the others. You cannot reduce mind or society or culture to brain. The reductionist program is bankrupt. What is not bankrupt is the evolutionary and the Evo-Devo tradition in embryology, which basically looks at what happens in the boundaries between systems that are each other's environments. Brain, mind, society, and culture are each other's environments, and they have obligatory exchanges with each other. And if they don't get those exchanges, things begin to change, often in very bad ways. And you can do rigorous science at the boundaries of these interchanging systems without going to any kind of reductionism. And there are practicing bodies of rigorous science that demonstrate that you can do rigorous science in a non-reductionistic way. Now, that's, so far in the world of abstract ideas, what I just said. And I'm not, I don't want to burden this conversation with too much in that, but that we can and should aspire to understanding the whole human critter and not compromising on that. There are plenty of conundrums, plenty of antinomies. There's lots that can really tie you into knots trying to untangle them, but that's where it's at. I mean, it's supposed to be easy. It's not.
It never is.
It never is. And so
I'm sorry, Dr. Shay.
Yeah,
I just
sure.
want to, if we can stop right there. Just and then
Okay.
you'll have opportunity. Everyone here will have opportunity to talk to you more after the Q&A session. I just want to pause right there, just so we can open it
Sure.
up for
Great.
responses
Fine.
and reflections.
Yeah.
The whole panel will pause right here, and then
Okay.
just open it up for questions from the guest. But thank you so much.
I think the panel could actually solve all the problems that we have. I'm serious. I really think that it would be perfectly. I mean that we know what the answers are. My question is, how do we have, or is there any way of studying how we make the change? Because we know, the communists were the last people who actually said, we've got a plan to change the face of the earth. We don't have a plan. And it seems to me that on one level, we need to be concentrating on how do you actually create change? Because they all know. We know what's the right thing to do. So my question is, how do we shift it? How do we change it?
Does someone on the panel want to tackle that question? one of you?
I
Okay,
just
Adrian.
have a thought. I just have a little thought. I guess I'm just going to push back on what you said about. I do recognize what you mean when you say war is the most base thing. Do you know what I mean? It sort of stops every conversation if you use stories from war. Like, you can't really speak to the life or death thing. It's hard to tell more quiet, sort of mundane stories. So I think one way would to not be focusing on the extremes all the time, because I feel, and it's not to say that, and I think that by that implicitly is focusing on the healing. If you're not focusing on, if you sort of lead in maybe, but you're focusing on what happened and how you changed this because you were a psychologist who couldn't deny the social circumstances in which clients were trying to resolve the problems of their lives. So I just would put up a red flag for the extreme stories, or freezing the frame in the extreme moment of the ongoing story. An argument for the mundane, I guess.
Thanks, Adrian. Is there another question or comment? Oh, you have to respond to that? Okay, all right. Stefan?
I don't have the magic answer, obviously, but it's just, well, obviously, but the Dalai Lama was recently asked us, what's the most important thing that we should be meditating on? And he said, the living Dalai Lama, and said, what to meditate? Give me a second. He said, because I'm leaping to the second part. Oh, he said, critical thinking followed by action. And so I think the beginning, to put it in Naibi's terms of thick and thin, the thin would be each of us to take action in our daily lives. The thick of it is that if we want to change policy, and I've heard you mention this before, if we want to change policy, we have to go into politics and change the political landscape of things. I mean, to me, it astounds me that this country is as old as it is, and we don't have an equal representation in Congress of women that we have for population in the military. We don't have equal representation of any group in any of our legislative branches that's proportional to what we actually have as a national, as a nation. So that would be one thing. As much as I think most of us would loathe to go into politics, that is one thing. But in activism in whatever form we can do. And maybe, I'm probably stating the obvious, but that's just, what I think.
Any other responses to that question, Khary?
You know, I think that it goes back to a lot of the comments already from the panel. I think one is that there has to be a more concerted effort, I believe. Too often I feel like I'm in conversations where people refuse to break down the barriers between issues. That there has to be a focus on what are the macro issues that are interconnected between the struggles we're talking about, so that we may not be able to tackle the 15 struggles we would put up on the board that speak to the greatest amount of inequity in our country. We may be able to tackle 3 of them initially, but the tangents reach into every other issue as well. And somebody may need to submerge what's the main issue they're working on to realize a macro issue that is still touching their issue. So as an example, if we were to step back and say, well, there's over 12 million people who are undocumented in this country who are facing a unequal status in the country, A, or unequal status, and B, if made documented, would more than likely disproportionately be voting on a progressive side. That may be an issue we're going to put front and center, and you may have to take your issue and not focus on it as much, just as an example, right? So how do we find those core issues, 1? And then I think 2, once we find those core issues, how do we have a concerted effort around it? The right's made a lot of mistakes, but 40 years ago, there was a rational, coherent, right-wing ideology. There were people you could literally have a conversation with. You would read books, you may agree or disagree, but it was a rational, coherent philosophy. Now, this isn't a good thing, so I'm not saying we should pattern and become irrational as well, but there was a concerted effort over 40 years to organize around God, gays, and guns, right? And every effort was made to radicalize its voting population around these very broad themes. I don't want us to become irrational. I don't want us to have these kind of didactic views on things. But I do think at times it's important to dial down what are the progressive values we're all working on. What does it mean to have a common humanity? What does it mean to have commonality between us so that we can go back and work in prison reform, in gender equity, in issues having to do with educational access, whatever we're talking about, bringing those common themes back. And so when you talk about the need to completely deconstruct the prison industrial complex as an example, that would affect so many of the issues that we are all talking about here. And it's big picture thinking. It's not how do we slightly reform juvenile justice or how do we stop being one of the few places that prosecutes juveniles as adults. But instead, what does it look like to completely change the system? And by doing that, that will affect so many of the issues we all work on.
Can I just second that? That sometimes we might think that there's a group, an organization, an action that is creating some kind of positive change, and the ripple effect goes far beyond what original problem they were trying to tackle. So that's why I want to second this idea. I've done a lot of research looking at poverty transition programs. There's one that's based in Harlem where they use a microcredit, micro-lending model with very, very low income people. They have phenomenally high loan payback rate amongst very poor people who would never qualify for an entrepreneurial loan. Part of the reason is they use, as a Canadian socialist, I love the model because it's a collective experience model where you have a peer group and you apply for a loan. If anyone in your group cannot pay back their business loan, collectively you have to pay it back together on their behalf. It's one of the reasons that it's been so successful. But when I went in to study it, I wanted funding from NIH, so I had to frame it in a mental health way. So I said, I'm going to go in and study depression. What I found was that there was a significant drop in depression. This is not a mental health organization in any way. The rates of reduction of depressive symptoms were comparable to the published rates achieved through psychiatric medication and through individual psychotherapy. And what we found was the predictive factor is that they work collectively, and they said it was the collective experience of being amongst the communal known, where they all knew each other, working towards a common goal of getting not you, but collectively all of you out of poverty. That was the statistical predictor predictor of the reduction in depressive symptoms. They're not even about doing mental health, but we can look at one thing and see the other effects that it has. Another group I've worked with, INTAR, the International Network for Treatment Alternatives in Recovery, they look at things like first break psychosis, so when someone has a first psychotic episode, and instead of using mainstream treatments, drugs, etc., they use something called open dialogue, where they surround the person with the people in their community, literally don't leave them alone day and night, and don't make them leave their home. And the rates that they have in avoiding a second psychotic episode are truly astounding. If there were a drug that could do that, believe me, Eli Lilly would be on that, right? I don't believe there ever will be a drug that can achieve that, because it's through the collective understanding of self that it actually works. And so I think, but these things need to be funded. This is why I also want to push back, Stefan, because you directly disagreed with me. But I believe it's all political, because if the small percentage of the military budget that would be needed to restore arts programs to the public schools in this country would be such a small percentage, and yet what it would do for this country would be tremendous. That's a political action that needs to be taken. So we really need to do both. And I think collectively we can, because what we're really good at in a group like this is knowing, getting the knowledge out there to each other, and actually having that knowledge inform the action that we take. And so I think that that's something that collectively we can do.
Well, we moved on a bit, but I just, I was struck by what you said about not focusing on, maybe trying not to focus so much on the extremes, but tell the things that are going on more generally, sort of the undercurrents. And then also your mention of the need to kind of try to focus on macro issues and establish what we as progressives, what are our values. And that's been something that I've been sort of scared away from touching all my life, is sort of to address values. What are my, I mean, I know I have them. I know, how I was raised, and I know my education, but talking about values with people has been something that I really haven't done that much. I mean, and I choose people to surround me who share my values, but you don't talk about it so much. And the right has. The right has, and I think that that's just very interesting, and I think that this is something that speaks to not addressing so much the extremes, but what we're talking about is a crisis of culture, and how do we talk about that in a way that's urgent, where we feel it's urgent, without using these extremes necessarily, but something that's very general, and trying to locate it is also the problem.
I just wanted to comment that I think it's important for us not to feel too hopeless or discouraged about all these things. I mean, I don't want to be a Pollyanna, pie in the sky optimist either. I mean, we could spend the whole evening talking about all the ways that, everything's going downhill. But I've lived long enough to see changes that I would never have believed possible in my youth. When Carol and I first got married, she couldn't get a credit card in her own name. I mean, it had to be in the husband's name. I mean, that would be, nobody could imagine that these days. It was a crime for two adults of the same sex to have consenting sexual relations with each other. When I say crime, they could be put in prison, and they were put in prison. We now have gay marriage. You can go through the list. The Vietnam War, seemed impossible. Finally, it ended, but that was because hundreds of thousands and millions of people marched in the streets. Whoever thought that was going to happen? Look at the civil rights revolution. I mean, obviously it's an unfinished battle, and of course there are, counter movements and so forth. But the fact is, things are not the same that they were. I mean, I could go on and give a dozen examples. You can all come up with them too. I just want to say that there has been more change in my lifetime than I could ever have imagined when I first heard of it. It wasn't until a few years ago the Supreme Court stopped America from executing its own children. We were one of only 6 countries on earth that still gave capital punishment to children, meaning people under the age of 18, 16, 17-year-olds. There was a legislator in Texas who wanted to lower the age to 12. I mean, you know, we were one of the last countries to, you know, we are also the only Western democracy that still has a death penalty, but one state after another is now abolishing the death penalty. Maybe every year or two, another state does. You know, we have, abortion is legal now. Yes, there's a huge, you know, reaction against it. It's a battle. But the fact is, it is still legal. I mean, you know, so you can just go through the list. I just think it's important for us to recognize that things that seem inconceivable now, just off the range of possibility, could actually happen within the next few years.
Thank you, James. Khary?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to respond to your point, but also off of something that James said. I mean, I think that, you know, as I talked about and others talked about, it's absolutely essential that we're doing this kind of broad organizing work, you know, the deep dive, the building of bridges between our efforts. But as another part of the theme today, I also really do believe the importance of storytelling, the importance of changing narrative, and that's what I mean by storytelling. I don't mean all of us becoming novelists and short story writers, but that's cool too. But within our work and within our space, how do we change the narrative? So yes, it was unconscionable that this country continued to execute people who committed crimes as juveniles, and we supported the amicus brief to change that law. But here in liberal New York, with a quote-unquote democratic liberal governor, we are one of 2 states in the United States of America that tries 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. I have 16-year-old kids this tall who are put in Rikers Island. You can only imagine what occurs to them. That's in our state. That's under our watch. Where is our narrative, our conversation, our voice around that? And so I think it's imperative that we push back on the silencing that you've experienced, and I think all of us have experienced, right? I mean, the word liberal has been turned into like a derogatory word, right? People will say, I'm not a liberal, and they'll use some other word as if there's something wrong with that, whereas conservative, everybody wants to claim now in the political space. Even the Democrats want to claim to be a conservative Democrat. And so I think it's important in all of our spaces that we're pushing back against that. We're objectively, openly identifying as whatever. I'm not telling people to identify any way you don't want to, but if you are liberal and progressive, talk about your work in that way. Push the agenda forward. Push back against these kind of false narratives. You know, I think a lot in my work, you know, I'm inspired by my grandfather. My grandfather was a convicted felon, right? My grandfather was put in a federal penitentiary. Some would just claim it in that way. Well, I see him as a radical organizer who was incarcerated because he violated the Smith Act. They said he was advocating the overthrow of the United States government. He was a union organizer who believed in equality for all and signed up for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and went to fight in Spain. I mean, talk about putting your viewpoint, your politics front and center. He volunteered, didn't scream at his television. You know, he didn't say this is, you know, bad and storm in the other room. He got on a boat, picked up a gun, and went to fight against Franco. And when I think about that he was seen as the criminal, and he was called in front of HUAC, and he was told he was un-American, he was the most American person in that room, right? The people representing the government were the un-Americans, he was the American. But that whole narrative was flipped on us. And if we don't reclaim our radical history, our liberal history, our progressive history, and take ownership on what we think brought about the changes you're talking about, if not for liberal, progressive, radical people, all the changes you're talking about wouldn't have occurred. And so I sometimes think that very base thing we lose sight of. Like, we don't think we have to push that dialogue or that conversation. We do the work in our spaces, but I think both have to go hand in hand. I think that's very, very important that we reclaim those narratives.
Thank you, Khary.
My name's David Amodio, and first of all, thanks to the panel. This has been really inspiring and enlightening so far. But one question I have for you all is, this is about common humanity, and here we're kind of in I'm guessing like a safe in-group where we share a lot of values here. And believe me, I'm on board with all this stuff. But there are battles to be fought, but if it's a common humanity, does this mean everybody? And also, like Dr. Shay was saying, we got to understand the human critter. I'm a social psychologist primarily, and I study things like prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination and all types of bad things that happen. And I feel like I have to try to get inside the heads of the people who do the bad stuff, or the things that I at least disagree with, in order to figure out why they're doing it, and then how I might be able to convince them that it's not a good idea. Instead of, so I can understand you've got to fight the battles, and that's what we've been talking about most of the time, but also, what do you think about bringing people in, or is that another complementary strategy?
I'm just smiling because I'm thinking about just the moment when you say, you know, common humanity, I'm thinking about, you know, a comedian that I've followed for many years who has a very large, loyal fan base. And he sort of takes on a new issue once in a while and decides he's going to begin to float it out there and challenge his fans. And you should see the faces of your loving, loyal fan base when you just speak out an idea that is new to them. It's a scary thing. I mean, it's actually, it can be a violent thing. You know, it can be, and this is in a room where people are choosing to go, they've paid money to go, they're out to have fun. It's just a person speaking. It's not somebody trying to get them to do anything except hear out. And it's a very, it actually, just talking about it is making my heart race because it's a very anxiety-producing moment to watch the reaction of a crowd that is just receiving something that they really don't want to think about. So I was laughing because that's a really good question. And I guess in the spirit of that, I just would like to add about the human critter. There's a lot of talk in these last sessions about war and trauma, and one thing that in teenagers and all kinds of things, but one thing that hasn't come up, and I just want to just mention it because it has to come up, is pornography, the use of pornography among people, you know, during war, the issues around adolescence now in pornography, issues around genders. I mean, it's a huge business. It's as, you know, it's comparable to talking about the business of incarcerating people in terms of money. It's completely undercovered by the press, but it's just something that I want to mention because it's one of those things that I think crosses into everything in terms of well-being. And so I guess in that spirit of another difficult, I have no answer, I don't know. Just.
Do you mean for PACH, or do you mean as far as what Tina was talking about, taking over the world?
The people who you're going to fight the battles against. I mean, you could fight battles where you win and they lose, but maybe also you need to figure out why are they that way. So there's a lot of research on power, what it does, how it changes the way you think and perceive things, and what people will do anything to maintain the power. And there are so many other examples, but common humanity suggests inclusiveness. So that just strikes me as a little bit different than a lot of the things that have been talked about so far.
So you're saying less of a battle and more of an embrace?
Well, it seems like both probably are important. Clearly there are battles. I mean, Khary talked about, I love the 4 different aspects, components to making progress, but
could I just say, I mean, you know, in a democracy, the only way we are going to win battles is through persuasion. I mean, it's a matter of persuading people. It's not. We're not going to. It's not so much defeating them, I'd say, as inducing them to change their minds. But I agree with you. At least I think this is what you're implying. I absolutely think it's essential, no matter who we're dealing with, to treat them with respect. I mean, we may disagree with them. What was it Voltaire said once? I disagree with everything you're saying, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. And I think that we need to take that attitude that we respect people. We're not trying to humiliate them. I mean, if there's one thing that will keep them from being persuaded is if we say you're stupid. But I think we have to treat people with the respect of assuming that if we can give them a rational argument and reliable data, sooner or later, at least enough of them will be persuaded that we can change policies that we can demonstrate are very destructive to our common humanity.
I know, Niobe, you want to say something?
I want to say something, and then Dana. So I just, in some sense, David, your question is the reason why we wanted to do PACH, right? Which is to tell the story. This is related to Khary's point too. Which is to tell the story that when you begin to tell the story of our common humanity, whether it's me quoting my boys, Carol quoting her girls, Stefan quoting his experience, what you end up getting is everybody's listening and everybody's resonating. across political divide. So the thing that's most striking for me is I will get interviewed by right-wing Southern radio stations, and they will love my book. And what is my book? It's really just about boys being human and talking about their desires. And they'll say that it sounds very Christian to them, right? They'll bring in, like, my whole message, I've been told, so interesting, as a proud agnostic, I've been told I have a very Christian message. And I've been told by rabbis I fit right in with the Judaic tradition. And what is that? It's actually just about, right, the conversation we had last time about communicating love. Boys want to be loved, they love. That this is how what the real boys sound like, and all of a sudden you're going across religious divide, political divide, and it's in some ways it's persuasion, but it's not persuasion saying, believe me, believe me, believe me, I'm right, you're wrong. It's saying, listen to these boys talk. Listen to what they said when you asked them this question. They start talking, and everybody's listening. And the same thing happened, Carol, to you when you brought out the girls' work. And so at some level, it's we wanted to have PACH because that's the way we persuade. I mean, if you follow what I mean, that's our persuasion, is to go back to, we share a common humanity, we share a responsibility, right? And let me tell you what actually people sound like. Right? I mean, I'm thinking about, not everybody believes we share a common responsibility, but once you listen to, for me, of course, as a developmentalist, once you listen to young people talk, and they're speaking in ways that reveal their humanity, nobody can say, I'm against the humanity of that kid, right, once they hear that. So, I mean, I just think about persuasion is we have to get out of the box of thinking persuasion in the old way, which is, I'm going to persuade you that I'm right and that you're wrong. It's actually just persuasion through listening to each other and connecting to that common humanity, and that is profoundly persuasive.
Listening to the evidence.
Right, listening to the evidence, exactly. Yeah. I know Dana has
Maybe one or two more questions.
Yeah, probably two more.
Two more questions, and we'll close it out.
Hi, I'm Dana Zucker. How's it going? My background's in strategic communications, and it's not on.
It's on.
It's
on.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Just talk a little bit.
Okay. This is more of like a overall statement and kind of challenge for all of us as we continue. Adrian, you touched upon something that I'm relating to a lot when someone asked about how extreme do you need to go in your stories, or how many of these stories can you write regularly. And as a reader and as someone who works in a similar industry, I myself am numb to seeing it, hearing about it. I may even avoid it, all of it kind of lumping together in one big ugly bucket. Yet every now and then there are some instances where stories break through, and we all are listening, and we all are, touched by it. And it's one thing when we're sitting in a room and hearing your personal stories told so eloquently, but when we go out with our mission and try to tell it to the world, I think what we should all start trying to do is make a point to notice when these stories are breaking through in our everyday life, jot them down, share them on the website, but just be very conscious about it, because we all and you all are absolutely brilliant and experts, and you know it, and we're supportive of each other, but telling this is going to be a whole nother challenge. And starting to think about ways that people have told a story to you that have either gotten you into your profession or resonated with you is going to be exactly what we're going to have to do to tell it to a larger audience. So as we go forward, just be aware when you are impacted by something and think about it or share it, so we can also learn from it and take it forward.
Thank you, Dana. Yes. Hi.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kent Harbour. I'm also a social psychologist, and I'm at Rutgers. And so my question is sort of a corollary to David's, which is, I think that Naomi sort of outlined the goals of the common humanity. I think we're all sort of nicely put. I think we subscribe to it. But as I hear the speakers talking, I think sort of where, as we're listening to it, while there is a common humanity, I think that we probably have a very distinctive set of values, and that they're implicit in what you're saying. And I hear sort of, so when Corey talks about his grandfather being the only American, which is a very neat story about him being in the Spanish Civil War, that means something. And when you talk about the progress that has occurred, that means something. We talk about sort of what we mean about being a progressive or a liberal, that means something. I think that maybe it's helpful to sort of crystallize what it means to have the values that we think are going to be important. But in doing so, that does create, there's a common humanity, but there won't be a common mindset. And so how do you do both? How do you have a common humanity and also have a distinctive ideology? How do you both sort of embrace but also sort of be assertive and distinctive? And I think, you know, I think that there is, so I think that's my question to you guys.
Thank you.
I'll take a stab.
Khary.
I mean, you know, I think that there's a continuum to me when you start talking about how broad the conversation goes and who we're trying to be inclusive with, and what does humanity mean when you start talking about some of these polarizing issues. So to me, just to pull out one issue, I think that class inequality and inequity in this country is a foundational issue. And you have millions of people voting against their interests because they've been sold a false narrative. I think at its core, it's not even really about the income inequality, but the inhumanity of those creating the false message. So I think actually inhumanity is at the core, which leads towards the income inequality. And so what I mean by that, if people aren't following me, is that if we look at, for instance, the anti-labor work right now in the country, and I don't want to go on a whole thing about labor. Obviously, there are mistakes the labor movement has made, many, but in general, that labor historically was on the side of working people. And you see the kind of labor struggles that have occurred around the country. I think there are millions of people who would see themselves as opposed to our viewpoint of what a progressive vision looks like. They may vote conservatively, they may think conservatively, but their interests are not being served by those who they're supporting. And they would be open to the narratives and the understanding, if we communicated it correctly, to get people to understand this view of humanity is one that's inclusive of them. I don't know if that's inclusive of the Koch brothers, right? I don't know if those who are actually behind the efforts to end unions in the country would be interested in our conversation, and I don't know that that should drive it. I think what we're talking about more broadly is who can we bring to the table? Because my view is that what they're doing is not that the Koch brothers and others on the conservative side really care about education, right? They're trying to break the teachers' union because it's the two representations of major political dollars that come from the progressive side. If the two major funders were steel unions, they'd be trying to break the steel union. So it's not about education, it's about their political power. In order to do that, they're selling this false narrative around labor and education to many people who are now voting against their interests, many people who have bought into this narrative. I think we can convince those people over generations in the way that young people today, to your point, are so much more progressive around gay marriage, so much more accepting of interracial relationships, friendships, and marriage, because it's changed over generations. I think we can reach people on that side through new narratives. I don't know if the common humanity reaches to those who are articulating an inhumane vision of what politics look like in this country, if that's clear. So I think there's a great deal of space to bring people over to, quote, our side, without it being a war or without it being something where there is, you know, where there are people who are left outside the dialogue. They can be with us, but there may be those who are orchestrating some of these divisions who, as FDR talked about, will be diametrically opposed to anything we're doing to change the conversation because of their own personal interests. And so that's where, again, I think that the organizing runs hand in hand with the storytelling.
It's good. I just say I think we're faced with a kind of logical dilemma or paradox here, which is you can say that the world is divided into people who think everybody is equal and those who think the world is divided into the superior and the inferior. But the people who think that everybody is equal are superior to those who think that the world is divided into. And I think that's something we have to look out for and not come off as though we're saying we're superior and you're inferior because you think that's the way the world is. We have to treat people, everybody, with respect.
Well, but actually we don't think that when we wouldn't, right? We would not think, we would think that because we think we endorse equality that there is something superior to that. And maybe we should not be embarrassed about that.
Well, yeah, no, that's okay, except I would try to put it more in terms of, you know, these are empirical questions. We can demonstrate through empirical research that human beings live longer. There's less homicide, there's less suicide, there's less, You know, that the general welfare improves if you pursue certain policies. That's not to say that people that don't know that yet are inferior. It's just they haven't yet learned that. But, you know, it's a matter of education. It's a matter of scientific research. I mean, as Harry Stack Sullivan said once, science proceeds by way of consensual validation. That is, experts in a field, you know, reach a consensus. And then basically that's what's accepted as the scientific reality at that time. I'm saying if we can kind of get this into that kind of mindset rather than, you know, I'm superior, you're inferior, but rather, here's what the data shows. Maybe we can at least diminish the degree to which we are implicitly insulting, you know, the people that disagree with us.
Okay. Nabi, did you want to make a wrap-up comment, or? Okay. Okay. So we'll stop there then. Thank you.